Chapter 1, The Whisper Sewn into the Flag. It was in the waning days of October, with the air sharp and full of whispers from rustling leaves outside our Baker Street lodgings, that a mystery both singular and somber found its way to the feet of Sherlock Holmes. The city was gripped with an unusually early chill, the Thames already beginning to cough mist in the mornings like a man too long exposed to damp stone. I had returned from a brief sojourn to the countryside, believing I might enjoy a few weeks' respite from the excitement and unease that often accompanied Holmes' ventures. Alas, I ought to have known better. Holmes was in one of his peculiar moods, a state of dormant fire, eyes too bright, fingers steepled, and tobacco smoke coiling in drifts above his head like ghostly serpents. I had not yet removed my coat when he spoke without looking at me. "You have acquired a stain on your left boot, Watson. Red clay streaked with granite flecks, Surrey if I'm not mistaken. Moreover, the smudge of chimney soot on your lapel suggests your train passed through the Reigate tunnel just after a cleaning fire was doused." I could only smile. "My dear Holmes, it appears you are well tuned this morning." "It is not the tuning I lament, Watson, but the absence of a suitable melody. For a week I have read the news from every borough of this nation and beyond, and nothing, not a poisoned butler, nor a vanishing actress, nor a forgery of even modest wit, has dared disturb the tedium." As if on cue there came the crisp rap of knuckles on the lower panel of the front door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man who seemed both official and burdened by an invisible weight. His naval overcoat, though clean and pressed, bore the subtle scent of brine, and his face, marked with wind-chapping and sun-etched lines, spoke of years on open water. He removed his cap, revealing a crown of steel-gray hair cropped close. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, though there was little doubt in his tone. "I am Captain Elias Holt, Royal Navy, retired. I've been told you are the man to consult when a matter is inexplicable." Holmes gestured to the fireside chair. "Pray, sit. The inexplicable is my sole province, Captain Holt. Tell us everything and begin, if you would, with the precise hour at which you first suspected something was wrong." The captain exhaled, nodding once, and began. "It concerns a flag, Mr. Holmes. A particular flag, naval standard, crimson-dyed, gold-fringed, stitched by hand in 1854 and passed down through generations of captains who served aboard Her Majesty's ship Icarian. A ceremonial relic now, of no small sentimental value, but not publicly significant. It hung aboard the Icarian until her final decommissioning in 1893. Since then, it has rested in a sealed glass case inside the Holt family estate in Devon." He paused, frowning. "Last fortnight, we brought it out for the centennial reunion of the Icarian's surviving crew. A modest affair, 17 gentlemen in all. We unfurled the flag in the Grand Hall. Toasts were made. Anecdotes shared. But 3 nights after the gathering my housekeeper, Mrs. Danzy, came to me in a state of fright. She claimed to hear voices in the hall at night, faint, whispering like wind through canvas. I thought it nonsense. But when I entered the hall myself, I too heard something." He swallowed. "It was not the wind." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes hawk-like. "What did you hear, Captain?" "A voice. Muted, indistinct. As though coming from the cloth itself. I could not make out words. But my blood ran cold, Mr. Holmes. And then 2 days ago the flag was gone." Watson blinked. "Gone? Gone?" repeated Holt. "The case stood intact. No broken glass. No sign of forced entry. The servants deny any knowledge. The doors were locked, windows bolted. And yet the flag vanished as surely as if the sea had swallowed it." Holmes closed his eyes and inhaled the pipe's smoke like incense, as if the shapes it formed might offer guidance. "You say the flag has no public value," Holmes murmured, "and yet you fear its disappearance holds greater meaning." "I do," said Holt gravely. "For 2 days before it vanished, someone, perhaps more than one, began sending cryptic letters. No handwriting, just typed lines, one per envelope. The last read simply, 'The whisper is sewn in the hem.'" Watson stiffened. "Do you still have the letters?" The captain removed a folded envelope from his inner coat. Holmes opened it carefully. Within lay a single sheet, yellowed slightly, with one neatly typed line in an old naval courier font. "The whisper is sewn in the hem." Holmes smiled. It was not a smile of amusement, but of invitation. Assent had finally touched the air. "You were right to come," he said. "A flag that whispers, vanishes without a trace, and leaves behind a message stitched in metaphor? My dear Watson, I believe our melody has begun." And with that, the case of the whisper sewn into the flag was underway. Chapter 2, The Visitor in Grey and Holmes' First Deduction. The fog that coiled through Baker Street the following morning seemed to Watson unusually thick, as if London itself were holding its breath. Holmes had spent the better part of the previous evening seated cross-legged on the carpet, the Holt letter splayed beside him, a naval chart of the British coastline on the table, and a magnifying glass in his hand. He was silent through supper, declined brandy, and had not once mentioned the violin. When Watson descended the stairs the next morning, he found Holmes already up, dressed, and thumbing through Lloyd's Naval Register. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said without lifting his gaze. "Today promises movement, if not revelation. You suspect the thief will strike again?" "I suspect he already has. But the striking is not the key, Watson. It is the listening. The case is a whisper, and so we must learn to hear." Before Watson could inquire further, Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a silver tray. "A lady, sir. Says she must see you urgently." Holmes took the card and raised a brow. "Miss Ameline Torrell. Not a name I recognize." "Nor I," said Watson. "Show her in," Holmes replied. A few moments later, the door opened to reveal a young woman of about 30, her expression composed but eyes betraying an anxious intensity. She wore a traveling coat of ash-gray wool and a modest bonnet of morning black, though there were no signs of recent bereavement. Her gloves, Holmes noted, were well worn at the fingertips. "Miss Torrell," Holmes greeted her. "Pray, sit. I presume your visit pertains to the Holt estate." She blinked. "Yes, but how could you know that?" Holmes gestured faintly toward the smudge of salt and lichen dust upon the hem of her coat. "Devon clay, recent I should think, given the dampness still clinging to it. And your gloves, torn at the left index, suggest rough handling of cloth or rope, perhaps flag bunting." She sat down, visibly unsettled. "I came because I was once in service at the Holt estate, a companion to Mrs. Holt before her death. I left 2 years ago, but when I heard what had happened, what people were whispering, I had to speak." Holmes nodded. "Whispers again. A recurring theme. Do go on." Miss Torrell twisted her hands. "The flag is no ordinary relic. It was never merely ceremonial. Mrs. Holt confided in me once, after a particularly stormy night when she was certain someone had broken into the West Wing. She said the flag held a message that could undo everything. She feared it." Watson leaned forward. "Feared it?" "She told me her late father-in-law, Rear Admiral Holt, was involved in something during his final commission aboard the Icarian. Something kept hidden. When the ship was decommissioned, he demanded the flag be preserved, untouched, and never unfolded without a Holt present. She said the hem had been resewn at sea, in secret." Holmes' eyes lit with quiet fire. "And no one questioned this?" "Not aloud. The Admiral was a stern man, given to violent tempers. Servants said he would disappear below decks for hours and return soaked to the bone, clutching the flag like a dying man with a wound." Holmes turned to Watson. "We have a whisper, a theft, and now, intentional concealment. The flag may not merely be a symbol but a vessel." Watson frowned. "A vessel for what?" "A truth," Holmes said. "Sewn into the hem." Miss Torrell removed a small item from her coat pocket and handed it to Holmes. "I found this in the old housekeeper's ledger when I returned. She passed away last spring. It's a page torn from a journal. I thought it might matter." Holmes took the aged parchment, the ink faded but legible. Read. "The Admiral locked it himself. After the trial. Said it was better than a bullet. So long as no one unfurls it, the storm remains at sea. The hem was dry by morning." Watson blinked. "What trial?" "An internal military matter, perhaps," Holmes murmured. "Covered, buried. But it seems it was not forgotten." He turned back to Miss Torrell. "Tell me, did anyone else know of your return to Devon?" "No," she said, suddenly pale. "Why?" "Because someone followed you here." Watson started. "Holmes, surely?" But Holmes was already at the window, flicking open the curtain. From the gaslit street below, the shadow of a man in a gray overcoat moved away swiftly, disappearing into the swirling fog. Holmes turned, face calm. "Watson, fetch your revolver. I believe we are being watched. And in this case, silence may be as deadly as any bullet." Watson nodded grimly. The game, it seemed, had already begun in earnest. Chapter 3, The Scene of Deception. The train to Devon cut through the morning fog like a knife through fleece. Holmes sat motionless in the corner of the compartment, his hat tilted low, eyes closed but mind visibly at work. I had learned long ago not to mistake his apparent slumber for idleness. His fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the windowsill, each beat in tune with some inner calculus of deduction. Beside him rested the scrap of the Admiral's journal, Miss Torrell's card, and a folded map of the Devonshire coast. We arrived at Holt Manor by late afternoon. The estate stood atop a wind-battered rise, flanked by leafless yews and stone boundary walls mottled with creeping moss. The building itself was of stern Georgian design, its windows narrow and its front doors marked by lion-headed brass knockers dulled with age. A house of tradition, secrets, and sea-bound ghosts. Captain Holt awaited us in the drawing-room. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn back just enough to permit the waning sun, though it did little to dispel the gloom. Holmes refused tea but requested access to the hall where the flag had been displayed. "This way," the captain said, leading us down a wide corridor lined with naval paintings and framed commendations. "We've touched nothing since it vanished. Not even the cleaner has entered." The grand hall opened before us, its ceiling arched high like the hull of an inverted ship. Portraits of Holt's ancestors lined the upper walls, each face weathered by war and weather. At the far end stood the empty glass case, tall, rectangular, its panes unbroken and its lock unforced. Holmes approached the case silently, kneeling beside its pedestal. He produced a small lens from his pocket and scanned the floorboards with the same intensity a naturalist might reserve for a rare insect. "Watson," he said, "note the dust." I stepped closer. "I see none." "Precisely," he replied. "Not even along the baseboards. The room has been disturbed, recently." Captain Holt frowned. "But I gave strict orders." Holmes raised a finger. "Not by your staff, I suspect. By your intruder. The glass bears no signs of entry, yet the flag is gone. This suggests either an inside accomplice, or a deception more elaborate than simple theft." He moved to the empty case, examining its hinges, then the corners of the frame. With gloved hands, he removed a strip of fabric wedged between the glass and the brass rim, barely a sliver. "A thread," he murmured. "Oh. Crimson dyed, naval weave and frayed by force." This was not a careful removal. The thief worked quickly, desperately. Vulcan bent closer. "Do you suppose he feared being caught? Or feared what the flag might reveal?" Holmes replied. "Tell me, Captain, who has keys to this case?" "Only myself. And my late father." Holmes stood, brushing lint from his coat. "And yet no key was used. Observe the scoring here." He pointed to a faint groove along the case's brass lip. A knife, thin and sharp, slid beneath the glass frame to lift the latch. Delicate work, likely rehearsed. Captain Holt swallowed visibly. "You mean, someone planned this?" "Indeed," Holmes said. "And now they seek to bury what the Admiral tried to preserve." We moved next to the fireplace, where Holmes crouched and examined the iron grate. A stack of charred papers sat at the edge, seemingly unremarkable until Holmes plucked one free with tweezers. "See the watermark?" he said. "Naval stationery burnt in haste. Watson, these ashes are only days old. Someone tried to erase something, perhaps an inventory, perhaps a log. But they were careless. See here, Icarian, log excerpt, July 3, 1893. Hem code affixed." He trailed off. "The rest is ash." "The hem," I repeated. "As in the flag's hem?" Holmes nodded. "I suspect the flag's lower lining may have concealed more than thread. A code, perhaps. Something sewn with deliberate secrecy." Captain Holt looked grave. "My grandfather's final year aboard the Icarian was plagued by rumor, mutiny whispers, a disappearance never officially logged. My father never spoke of it." "Therein lies your answer," Holmes said quietly. The truth was stitched into silence. Just then a soft knock at the hall's far door interrupted our thoughts. A maid entered, eyes darting nervously. "Forgive me, sir," she said to Holt, "but I found this, tucked behind the bookcase in the west gallery." She held out a small linen pouch, its drawstring pulled tight. Holmes took it gently, examining the weave. "Watson," he said, handing it to me, "do the honors." I opened the pouch and tipped its contents onto a silver tray. Out tumbled three objects: a brass button tarnished with age, a strip of parchment rolled tight as a scroll, and a peculiar shard of something that looked like lacquered cloth. Holmes unrolled the parchment, scanning it briefly. "It's ciphered," he said, eyes glinting. "Naval grade. Dated July 5, 1893. Captain Holt stepped closer. "So soon after the burned log." Holmes examined the button. "This," he said, "bore a uniform once. Naval pre-1900. Possibly torn during a struggle." "And the shard?" I asked. Holmes turned it in the light. "Flag canvas without question. Coated in resin. Why? To preserve something? Or conceal it?" He turned to the captain. You must give me access to the ship's last surviving log entries. And anyone who attended the reunion last week. Every name. I fear the theft is only the beginning. Captain Holt's mouth tightened. I'll have them delivered by nightfall. Holmes glanced at the empty flag case, then toward the window where twilight had begun its slow descent. The truth, he said softly, is unfurling. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. The study at Holt Manor had once belonged to Rear Admiral Nathaniel Holt himself. A chamber lined with sea charts, leather-bound logs, and a portrait of the admiral in full regalia glaring down like a judge from the past. It was here, by Holmes' request, that the remaining members of the Icarian Centennial Reunion were asked to gather. 7 men in all, survivors of distant waters and vanishing years, now assembled beneath gaslight to answer unspoken accusations. Holmes stood before the hearth, hands behind his back, his eyes flitting from face to face as though measuring their depths. Watson sat beside a small writing desk, pen poised, while Captain Elias Holt lingered near the door, his arms crossed tightly, gaze fixed on the floor. The guests arrived in staggered order, each introduced with a note of tension. First came Mr. Eustace Wren, the Icarian's former quartermaster. Tall, spare, his spine ramrod straight even after 2 decades on land. His eyes, a pale and piercing gray, swept the room as though plotting courses. Then Lieutenant Archibald Sloane, younger than the others by nearly a decade, now a port inspector in Portsmouth. He exuded nervous energy and fidgeted with his collar until Holmes silenced him with a glance. Third was Mr. Cyril Blaine, once the Icarian surgeon. A stout man with a florid complexion and hands that trembled ever so slightly when he removed his gloves. The fourth to enter was Dr. Reginald Thacker, formerly the ship's chaplain. His white beard lent him the appearance of a kindly scholar, though Holmes' eyes lingered on the faint ink smudges beneath his fingernails. 2 others followed, a pair of engineers, Hartley and Dunn, men of few words and thick arms, their gazes darting between Holmes and the Admiral's portrait. Lastly, a Mr. Lionel Ashe, who had served as cabin steward and now ran a modest public house in Devonport, slipped in with a touch of unease. I thank you all for coming, Holmes said evenly. Your presence may yet prevent further harm. I trust you've heard about the flag. Murmurs passed through the room, though Wren only nodded. Sloane looked away and Ashe flinched as if struck. Vanished, muttered Blaine. Damn shame. It was the last remnant of our days afloat. No, said Holmes. It was more than that. The flag was a vessel, a hiding place. Someone here knows what it concealed. And someone feared it enough to risk everything to destroy it. Gasps broke out, but Holmes raised a hand. Let us not rush. No acusaciones. Merely a series of observations. And perhaps answers. He turned to Wren. Mr. Wren, you oversaw the lower decks, did you not? Wren nodded slowly. I did, sir. Then you would recall if, during July of '93, the Admiral spent extended time below with the ceremonial flag. Wren's jaw clenched. I recall many things, Mr. Holmes. Not all of them proper to speak aloud. Speak them nonetheless. Wren hesitated. There was unrest. A seaman vanished, John Caro. The matter was hushed. Officially, he drowned in the night. And unofficially? Holmes' face remained unreadable, but Watson saw the muscles of his jaw tighten. A red herring, Watson, Holmes murmured. And a violent one. Sloane was not the thief, but he was close to the truth. The attacker likely believed he had uncovered too much. Then Sloane's search put him in danger? Indeed. He was perhaps beginning to understand that what had been hidden was not just scandal, but betrayal. Someone tried to bury it again, this time with a heavier hand. Holmes moved to the window and examined the sill. Fresh scrape. Mud. Heel mark, narrow. Too small for Blaine or the engineers. Giles frowned. You're suggesting one of the others returned last night? I suggest, Holmes said coldly, that our assailant left in haste and left clues in doing so. Clues they did not have time to erase. Holmes gathered the sketch and turned to Captain Holt. I must examine the Manor's laundry next. I believe our intruder may have discarded garments, perhaps with blood, perhaps with clay. You think he changed clothes? Watson asked. I think, Holmes replied, that someone is trying very hard to look innocent, and that our true culprit is hiding in plain sight. He turned abruptly and began toward the corridor, coat tails snapping behind him. Watson, bring your revolver. Inspector, seal the room. No one enters without my say. As Watson followed, he glanced back at Sloane, unconscious but breathing. Another victim of secrets sewn into silence. Chapter 6. The secret clue, a hidden inconsistency. The laundry rooms of Holt Manor, situated in the estate's eastern wing, were low-ceilinged and close, filled with the scent of damp linen and coal-heated copper kettles. Holmes descended into the stone-flagged space like a man descending into a vault, his gaze flicking from drying lines to wash barrels with a surgeon's precision. The head laundress, Mrs. Brachley, a stout woman with sleeves perpetually rolled and eyes like sharp pins, was already waiting. Captain Holt had summoned her per Holmes' request. "No one outside staff's been down here, sir," she insisted firmly. "No gentleman, I swear it." Holmes nodded but said nothing. He began to move through the drying garments, pausing at a bundle that had not yet been hung. "This load was washed when?" he asked. "Last night," Mrs. Brachley replied. "I do the linens just after dusk, same time every evening. That lot was delivered late by footman." "Which footman?" "Jem. He said it came from the guest wing, Mr. Ash's room, I believe." Watson, standing behind Holmes, frowned. "Lionel Ash?" "The steward." Holmes examined the bundle. Among shirts and collars was a gray overcoat, naval cut, frayed at the hem. Holmes lifted it by the shoulders and sniffed lightly near the lapel. "Gunpowder residue," he murmured. "Faint but unmistakable. Watson, do you recall the scent in the billiard room this morning?" Watson thought back. "Now that you mention it, yes. There was something acrid in the air. Not quite smoke, but not unlike it." Holmes held the coat to the light. Near the left cuff, barely visible to the untrained eye, was a rust-colored smear. "Blood," Holmes confirmed. "And this thread, naval red, pulled loose. This coat has seen more than a tavern scuffle." "Are you saying Ash attacked Sloane?" Watson asked. Holmes shook his head. "No. I'm saying this coat doesn't belong to Ash at all." Watson blinked. But the laundress said, "Let us speak to Jem, the footman. He was found near the stables, polishing a carriage lantern. Barely 20, his freckled face was alight with curiosity and nervous pride at being questioned by Holmes himself." "Mr. Ash gave you the bundle personally?" Holmes asked. Jem scratched his head. "No, sir. Found it outside his door, wrapped neat. Note pinned to the cloth said, 'Guest laundry, Mr. Ash.' That's all." "No signature?" "No, sir." Holmes nodded. "And Mr. Ash, has he been made aware of this?" "Don't think so, sir." "Good. Keep it that way." Back in the study, Holmes laid the coat out on the table. The firelight played across its seams. Holmes turned it inside out and examined the lining. He ran 2 fingers across the interior hem, pausing when his nail caught on a subtle bulge sewn into the stitching. "Watson," he said softly, "here is our inconsistency." With the precision of a surgeon, Holmes used his penknife to unpick the hem. From within he drew out a narrow slip of oilskin, folded many times, and upon it, ink, faded but legible. Holmes unfolded it carefully. The parchment bore a line of numbers, 5 rows, each 6 digits long. "Coordinates," Holmes muttered. "Or more likely cipher keys. Naval format, pre-war office standardization." Watson leaned closer. "Do they match the cipher note from Miss Torrell's pouch?" Holmes compared them. "They align perfectly." He turned to Captain Holt, who had just entered with Inspector Giles in tow. "Captain, I now believe your grandfather embedded at least 2 cipher fragments into items associated with the flag. This coat was never part of the ceremonial uniform. It's a decoy planted to distract or delay." "But by whom?" asked Giles. Holmes looked toward the fireplace. "The person who feared what Sloane had discovered. The same person who burned the ship's log fragments, planted the coat in Ash's name, and tried to pass suspicion onto others." Watson exhaled. "A red herring indeed. But why?" Holmes held up the cipher key. "Because the true secret was never simply about a vanished sailor or a guilty conscience. It was something larger, military, encrypted, and deliberately hidden for decades." Giles furrowed his brow. "You're speaking in riddles, Holmes?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "I am merely withholding final judgment until the facts finish whispering. But rest assured, Inspector, someone has just revealed themselves through overconfidence. I now know who the thief is not. And soon I shall know who they are." Watson watched Holmes quietly roll the parchment back into its oilskin and slide it into his inner coat pocket. There was something new in his manner now, not excitement but gravity. A shift like wind turning at sea. Later that evening, after supper was served but scarcely touched, Holmes retired to the manor library with the cipher notes spread before him and a quiet storm behind his eyes. Watson sat across from him, nursing a cooling cup of tea. "You seem unsettled," Watson said gently. Holmes nodded. We have uncovered an inconsistency, yes. But it is not the coat nor the cipher that troubles me. It is the absence. The absence of what? Of fear, Holmes replied. The culprit grows bolder. That means the danger has only begun. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The night brought a heavy rain. It lashed the windows of Holt Manor with the sound of distant drumfire, as if the sea itself were attempting to reclaim something it had once surrendered. The corridors of the estate grew hushed, servants walking more softly than usual, as if mindful that secrets were listening from the walls. Holmes did not sleep. He remained in the library long after midnight, bent over naval cipher charts, maps of the English Channel, and scattered fragments of parchment that now seemed to pulse with hidden menace. Watson, half dozing by the hearth, roused only when Holmes let out a low sound, neither surprise nor alarm but recognition. You found something? Watson asked, rubbing his eyes. Holmes tapped a pencil against the cipher sheet. The patterns changed, he murmured. The codes, when layered with naval transit logs from the Icarian's final voyage, indicate a rendezvous point. Not a battle site. Not even a patrol. But a meeting. Watson sat up straighter. A clandestine one? Unquestionably. Coordinates point to an uncharted cove off the Cornish coast. No record of engagement. But the Admiral's private journal mentions something peculiar. Cargo aboard, not for the crown but for the conscience. That line always puzzled me. You think the Icarian was smuggling something? Holmes shook his head. Not smuggling, delivering. And someone aboard feared the record of that delivery would resurface. Before Watson could reply, the door burst open. It was Captain Holt. His face was pale, jaw clenched. Holmes, there's been another incident. They followed him through the darkened halls to the conservatory at the rear of the manor. The glass roof thundered with rain, and in the corner, beneath a shattered case of nautical artifacts, lay a man, curled, groaning softly. Mr. Wren, Watson gasped. The former quartermaster's head was bloodied, one hand clutched at his side, and beside him lay the remains of a ceremonial compass, its lid torn off, the glass smashed. He's alive, Watson confirmed after kneeling. But badly bruised. His legs likely fractured. There's a cut across the brow, blunt force again. Giles, now summoned, stood beside Holmes. We had guards on the estate, the inspector muttered. No one reported movement. Holmes was already examining the room. A small window in the conservatory's corner had been unlatched, rain dripping from the sill. Forced from inside, he said. Wren didn't come here to admire artifacts. He came to retrieve something, or to hide it. He pointed to the broken compass. Another naval relic. And look, beneath the lid. Inside the shattered base of the compass, wedged between the layers of wood, was a slip of cloth, no larger than a postage stamp. Holmes extracted it with tweezers. It was crimson. And faintly stitched into the weave, barely visible under the lantern light, were 3 tiny letters. Ertzika. What does it mean? Watson asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stared at the cloth for a long moment, then glanced at Wren, now groaning as Watson tended to his wound. He came here to recover it, Holmes said. But someone followed him. And struck. Giles shook his head. Wren's not our thief then. Just another man chasing ghosts. Holmes turned sharply. No, Inspector. He is more than that. He was the keeper. Every ship has one. A man who knows what the logs do not say. Wren was the Admiral's quartermaster. Trusted. Discreet. If something was hidden aboard the Icarian, Wren would know where and why. Holmes rose and looked around the conservatory. The compass was his cache. The flag may be lost, but fragments remain. I suspect there are more markers like this. Objects hollowed, encoded, sewn. Captain Holt, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. But what are we truly chasing, Mr. Holmes? This is no longer a theft. These are assaults. People are being hurt. Holmes met his gaze. We are chasing the remnant of an event the Royal Navy chose never to acknowledge. An operation never recorded in public logs. Whatever the Icarian did off that coast in 1893, it was buried so thoroughly, it required the Admiral to sew fragments of the truth into linen and wood. Why not destroy it outright? Watson asked. Because the Admiral feared judgment more than disgrace. He preserved the truth for those who might one day demand it. Then he's involved? Not necessarily the culprit, Holmes said. But perhaps an accomplice. Or at the very least, someone shielding the true architect. Watson spoke slowly. The Royal Courier Kestrel, what do we know of it? Almost nothing, Holmes said. The designation is not in any official ledger. That suggests it was classified, outside normal naval channels. Possibly diplomatic, possibly military. Giles exhaled. That would explain the effort to keep it buried. Holmes nodded. And why someone has gone to such lengths to retrieve, or destroy, the flag. It wasn't merely a relic. It was a vessel for the Admiral's conscience. Holmes paused, then gestured for Watson to follow him into the corridor. They walked in silence until they reached the portrait gallery. I brought you here, Holmes said softly, because something is missing. Watson scanned the rows of stern faces and naval uniforms. What is? Holmes pointed to a gap in the wall, faintly visible marks where a small frame had once hung. There was a miniature here. I noticed it on our first day. It's gone now. A theft. More likely a precaution. Someone removed it quietly, perhaps believing it held a clue. And did it? Holmes gave a rare smile. I believe it did. The Admiral's cipher is a trail of crumbs. Whoever follows it finds more than history. Watson's voice was low. They find a secret worth killing for. Holmes' eyes were gleaming now. Exactly, Watson. And tomorrow I shall lay the final crumb. Chapter 9. A second attempt, the culprit strikes again. The morning began in silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the rustle of leaves outside Holt Manor, swept by a gentle but persistent wind. Holmes had risen before dawn. He refused breakfast, refused company, and vanished into the estate's eastern wing without explanation. Watson found him an hour later seated alone in the Admiral's old study, poring over a detailed chart of the Cornish coast with a compass, a map ruler, and 3 crumpled cipher fragments beside him. His pipe lay untouched on the arm of the chair, long gone cold. Your crumb, Watson said quietly. You intend to place it today. Holmes gave the smallest of nods. We've shaken the tree, Watson. Now let us see what falls. Before Watson could question further, a knock interrupted them. It was Inspector Giles, his face grim. Holmes, there's been another break-in. South wing. One of the servants heard glass shatter just after sunrise. Within minutes, they stood in the Manor's seldom-used library annex, a room filled with naval biographies, ledgers, and bound volumes of naval gazettes dating back to the early 1800s. The window facing the garden had been forced from the outside, its lower pane fractured, shards glittering on the carpet like ice. A trail of muddy prints led straight to a writing desk in the corner. It seems, Holmes said kneeling, our visitor came with purpose. Nothing else in the room disturbed. Watson peered over Holmes' shoulder. The top drawer of the desk sat half open, its contents rifled. Holmes reached in carefully and withdrew a torn envelope and a folded letter, naval letterhead, dated July 1893. Another remnant, Holmes murmured. It was concealed among the Admiral's lesser correspondence. Someone knew exactly where to look. Watson leaned closer. But didn't find it before? No. Which tells us this is a separate actor, or a more desperate one. Giles stepped forward. There were no prints on the grass outside. Rain must have washed them. But not before our thief tracked mud through the study, Holmes said. Carelessness, a sign of haste. Or fear. Holmes opened the letter. Its contents were brief. RCK holds. No handoff occurred. Cargo divertido. Buried below deck. Witness compromised. Awaiting instruction. May require final measure. Watson stiffened. A final measure? Likely a euphemism for silencing the witness, Holmes said. The letter aligns with the Admiral's journal and confirms something vital. The delivery never happened. The Icarian's secret cargo was hidden, and a witness, possibly Caro, stood in the way. Giles frowned. Then who was the letter addressed to? Holmes turned the envelope over, pointing to a symbol embossed on the flap. A stylized V crossed with an anchor. Not a name. A sigil. Whoever V is, they were party to the operation. Watson was about to speak when a second constable burst into the room. Inspector. It's Mr. Ashe. He's gone. They followed the constable at once to the guest wing. Lionel Ashe's room was in disarray, clothes scattered, valise overturned, the bed unslept in. A single note lay on the writing desk, hastily written. Couldn't stay. It's too close now. I thought the past would stay buried. But it never does. Holmes read it twice, then lowered it with a sigh. Ashe was never the mastermind. He lacked the resolve. But he knew enough to fear the unraveling. Watson stared at the room, frustration rising. Do you think he fled? Or was removed? I suspect he fled. But it won't save him. No sooner had Holmes spoken than a shot cracked across the estate grounds. One, loud, sudden, unmistakable. The three men bolted down the stair and through the front door, rushing into the autumn wind. At the base of the northern hedgerow, beside a half-buried stone fountain, lay Lionel Ashe, face down, unmoving, a revolver still clutched in his hand. Giles knelt, checking for breath. He's dead. Watson crouched beside him, lifting Ashe's wrist. Self-inflicted. Close range to the temple. Rigor hasn't yet begun. Holmes examined the revolver, carefully prying it from Ashe's grip. 1 bullet spent. 5 remain. No sign of a struggle. Giles straightened. So he feared exposure, and ended it himself. But Holmes didn't answer immediately. He instead knelt and examined Ashe's coat, a heavy wool garment stained at the collar and sleeves. With tweezers drawn from his pocket, he pulled a small thread from inside the inner lining. Red wool again, Holmes muttered. Same dye lot as the ceremonial flag. Watson's brow furrowed. He had a piece of it? No, Holmes said softly. He had handled it. Recently. Possibly even hidden it. Giles looked up. You think Ashe took the flag? No, Holmes replied. I think Ashe knew who did, and he feared their reach more than he feared the law. He stood staring at the body. This was not guilt. It was silence enforced by threat and shadow. Ashe was our second whisper, Watson. And now he too is gone. Holmes turned toward the house, his voice low. The game is no longer about solving a theft. It is about stopping a legacy of silence from becoming permanent. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The air within Holt Manor had shifted. Not in temperature but in tone. After the grim discovery of Lionel Ashe's body, silence fell over the household like a shroud. No one spoke above a whisper. Servants moved with cautious steps. Even Inspector Giles, usually stern and composed, carried an unspoken tension in his shoulders. Holmes retreated to the Admiral's study and locked the door. Watson, summoned only after an hour had passed, found him surrounded by maps, cipher sheets, and the Admiral's journal. The revolver taken from Ashe lay disassembled on the desk, alongside the red wool thread Holmes had extracted from the coat. Without looking up, Holmes spoke. We are nearing the heart of it, Watson. But the danger is quickening. Watson approached quietly. You believe Ashe was silenced? Holmes nodded. Whether by threat or design, he was manipulated. Driven to act as an unwilling sentinel, one who held a piece of the truth but dared not speak it aloud. He rose and crossed to the fireplace, where the Admiral's portrait still hung, watching like a judge from the wall. Consider the chain of events, Holmes said. The Icarian's final voyage. A mysterious delivery designated RCK, a hidden cargo that never reached its destination. A sailor, Caro, who likely witnessed something forbidden. The Admiral, burdened by conscience, conceals the truth not in ink but in cloth and code. And then, decades later, a reunion. The flag reemerges. And so does the danger. Watson rubbed his brow. But why now? Why wait all these years? Holmes turned, eyes gleaming. Because the past was dormant until the flag was unfurled. That act, the simple unfolding of fabric, threatened to awaken every buried truth. And someone watching from the shadows realized it had begun. Watson nodded slowly. And that someone fears what will be uncovered. Indeed. Holmes stepped back to the desk and tapped the Admiral's journal. Listen to this entry, one I overlooked before. July 6th. Caro spoke again. He threatened exposure. I warned him, the burden is not mine alone. We were 5. 5 who bore witness. 5 who agreed in silence. Watson straightened. 5. We've only accounted for 3 who might qualify, Wren, Blaine, perhaps Thacker. Precisely, Holmes said. And now Ashe is dead. Wren is wounded. The others are fraying under pressure. The 5th remains unnamed, but active. He turned and unrolled the cipher fragments once more. With the cipher partially decoded, I traced coordinates that align with the Admiral's naval charts, specifically to an inlet near Morgan's Reach on the Cornish coast. Unmarked. Remote. The journal mentions it obliquely, where the rocks drink salt and do not echo. A poet's description but clear to a sailor. Holmes laid a coastal chart flat and pointed to the spot. Here. A natural cove. Deep enough to anchor. Invisible from land. It's where the cargo was hidden, and where the secret has waited. Watson frowned. You believe the true motive was tied to that cargo? Holmes gave a short nod. I believe the Icarian transported something illicit. Perhaps arms, perhaps a prisoner, perhaps documents meant for an unapproved negotiation. Whatever it was, it threatened someone's authority. And now, the mere chance of it resurfacing has triggered a silent war among the few who remain. A knock came at the door. It was Captain Holt. You asked for all surviving logs from the Icarian homes. There's one more. My father had it stored in a private chest. I hadn't opened it until this morning. He handed over a leather-bound logbook, brittle at the edges. Holmes opened it with care, flipping to the pages marked by a red ribbon. Watson leaned in as Holmes read aloud. July 4th. Dispatched false entry to Admiralty. Declared sighting of foreign vessel. In truth, met agent aboard the RCK transfer incomplete. Agent hostile. Cargo retained for security. Caro observed interaction. Demanded answers. Admiral ordered silence. Watson exhaled. So it was sabotage. A cover-up inside the Navy itself. Holmes closed the book. And the agent, whoever they were, was never mentioned again. Nor was the cargo's final fate. But Caro knew. The Admiral feared him. And I suspect Caro was removed not by accident or storm, but by deliberate hand. Captain Holt sat heavily in a chair, visibly shaken. My grandfather, he tried to correct a wrong, didn't he? Holmes turned. Yes. And he paid for it with a lifetime of silence. A knock came again, this time from Inspector Giles. He entered without waiting. There's more. Dr. Blaine is gone. Gone? Watson said. Disappeared sometime after breakfast. His room left unlocked. Valise missing. A gardener saw him heading toward the village on foot, but he vanished before reaching the road. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then we flushed the fox from the brush, he said. He moved swiftly to the coat rack and retrieved his overcoat. Watson, fetch your revolver. Captain Holt, I need a carriage. We're going to Cornwall. Cornwall? Giles asked. Holmes nodded. The true motive lies where the whispers began. The sea may have held its tongue, but it remembers. He held up the cipher key and the letter from the hidden drawer. And if we are lucky, we shall arrive before someone attempts to bury the truth beneath the tide. Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes' Grand Strategy. The carriage cut through the wind-lashed countryside with urgency, wheels spinning over muddy lanes, the scent of salt growing sharper as the coastline drew near. Holmes sat forward in silence, the corner of his coat brushing against the cipher charts he had spread across his lap. Watson, seated opposite him, kept one hand near his revolver and the other gripping the leather strap by the window to steady himself on the jolting turns. They had left Holt Manor at first light, trailed discreetly by a second carriage bearing Inspector Giles and two constables. Holmes had shared little of his plan en route, save one cryptic remark. To catch a shadow, Watson, one must give it a place to stand. It was early afternoon when the road turned sharply and revealed the sea, a wide, gray expanse that swallowed the horizon. Below them, nestled between jagged cliffs, lay Morgan's Reach, the cove Holmes had identified from the cipher coordinates. It was exactly as the Admiral had described, a crescent of stone where waves whispered against rock and the gulls circled in uneasy silence. They dismounted some distance inland and approached on foot. The wind had grown sharper, slicing between the rocks as they descended the path. Holmes moved with surprising swiftness, his boots crunching over shale, his eyes fixed on a narrow cleft in the cliff face. There, he said softly. That outcrop. Watson, do you see the remnants of rope scarring on the stone? Watson peered closer. Yes. Cut marks. For mooring? Exactly. This cove once held a small boat. Likely the one used to offload or conceal the cargo. Holmes led them into the cleft, which opened into a shallow cave. The air inside was damp and close, but it bore the faint, unmistakable scent of oil and mildew. Along one wall, half buried under stone and sediment, lay the rotted frame of a crate, wooden, iron-bound. Holmes crouched and drew a knife from his coat, prying loose a length of brittle wood. Inside he revealed scraps of canvas, paper sealed in oilskin, and what appeared to be rusted tools, or implements of a different sort. Naval, he said. Possibly foreign. Look, Watson, the symbol. Do you recognize it? Watson squinted. A double-headed eagle. Russian? Indeed, Holmes said grimly. This was no routine smuggling. The Icarian was involved in a clandestine transaction. Perhaps diplomatic, perhaps far more sinister. And the cargo, while incomplete, was dangerous enough to justify a lifetime of silence. He stood and gestured to the surrounding stones. We shall make this our trap. Watson blinked. You intend to remain here? No. But the cipher shall. With a fresh trail, one that leads to a discovery far too tempting for our quarry to ignore. They worked quickly, planting false clues among the wreckage. Copies of the cipher fragments, a staged impression of a document signed with the Admiral's name, and a freshly written note folded in oilskin. Confirmed location. Original crate and contents intact. Return at dusk for final recovery. As they returned to the cliff path, Holmes selected a higher vantage point where they would conceal themselves behind a thicket of gorse and lichen-covered stone. The constables and Inspector Giles, following Holmes' precise orders, positioned themselves in a wide arc around the approach, hidden but ready. "Now we wait," Holmes murmured. The sun sank slowly into the sea, casting long shadows across the inlet. The wind grew colder, the hush more profound. Time passed. Watson, ever vigilant, checked his watch. 6:30. Then footsteps. They were faint at first but unmistakable. A figure was descending the cliff path with care, hood drawn, a satchel slung over the shoulder. Holmes did not move. The man reached the cave and entered without hesitation. "Now," Holmes whispered. Within seconds, Giles and the constables descended on the cleft, weapons drawn. A sharp cry of surprise echoed, followed by the scuffle of boots on stone. By the time Watson and Holmes reached the scene, the intruder had been wrestled to the ground, face bloodied, hands bound. It was Dr. Cyril Blaine. The former ship's surgeon stared up at Holmes with wild eyes. "You fool," he spat. "You don't know what you're unearthing." Holmes knelt beside him. "On the contrary, doctor. I believe I know precisely. The Icarian was tasked with intercepting, or perhaps trading with, a foreign operative. You were the designated keeper of the cargo. Caro witnessed the exchange and had to be silenced." Blaine struggled. "I did what I was ordered to do. And then spent 20 years making sure no one else would." Watson approached. "But why now? Why strike again after so long?" Blaine laughed bitterly. "Because the moment that flag was unfolded, it began again. The Admiral's conscience was dangerous. His riddles, his codes." Holmes interrupted. "And yet you failed to destroy them all. He outwitted you even in death." Giles stood over Blaine. "You'll answer for Wren's assault. For Ash. And for Caro, whatever your orders were, doctor, they've expired." Blaine turned his head away. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. A heavy dusk blanketed Holt Manor as the storm gathered anew, thick clouds clawing across the sky like a curtain drawing down on the final act. Holmes stood by the front window, unmoving, his eyes tracking the gravel drive where shadows now pooled like spilled ink. Watson, seated by the hearth, reread the letter Holmes had received, its threat precise, calculated, and chilling in its restraint. "Your bait was well laid. But the spider does not come to the flame, it extinguishes it." "I do not believe he will run," Holmes said quietly. "He stayed too long. Wren, Ash, Blaine, each was an expendable piece. But this man is different. He's not hiding. He's hunting." "Then what's his next move?" Watson asked. "To erase the last piece of the puzzle. Me." There was no drama in Holmes' voice, only certainty. He stepped away from the window and reached for the envelope once more. The tone is unmistakable. He knew the message would come into my hands. And he timed it perfectly, after Blaine's arrest, after the bait at the cove. It's a message of superiority. But it's also a misstep. "How so?" Holmes held up the paper to the lamplight. "Because the ink is fresh. Still damp in the crease. It was penned and delivered within the hour, meaning the sender is nearby." A sharp knock interrupted their conversation. Giles entered, looking flustered. "We've lost Pendrit," he said. "Gone from his room. Disappeared sometime after luncheon." Holmes did not react. "Did he take anything?" "Left behind everything. But the stable hands report a single rider left just after twilight. Said it was one of the visiting staff. No name. Didn't see the face." Holmes turned. "Then he's not fleeing. He's circling." Giles blinked. "What do you mean?" "He doesn't need to escape, Inspector. He only needs time to recover the last piece, the Admiral's personal cipher log." Watson started. "You mean the book Holt gave you?" Holmes shook his head. "That was only a journal. The cipher log, the one used to encode the message in the flag, was never turned over. Holt said his father never spoke of it. But I believe it still resides somewhere in this house." Captain Holt, now summoned, stood pale with disbelief as Holmes addressed him. "Think carefully. Did your father ever conceal items? Mention private safes? Floorboards, compartments, travel trunks he never opened?" The captain frowned. "Only his campaign chest. It's been locked for years. We keep it in the attic." Holmes nodded. "Show me. Now." They climbed the creaking stairs into the attic, where old portraits and crates sat beneath a shroud of dust. Against the far wall, beneath a canvas tarpaulin, stood a weather-worn naval chest. Its brass corners were tarnished and a thick iron lock hung over the latch. Holmes examined it closely. "This hasn't been opened in years." "I've never had the key," Holt admitted. "We assumed it was ceremonial." Holmes knelt and withdrew a set of narrow picks. Within moments the lock gave a faint click and swung open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small bound ledger with the Admiral's initials etched in gold. Beneath it, another relic, a folded piece of crimson wool cloth, frayed at one corner, and unmistakably from the original flag. Holmes exhaled. The cipher book, and a remnant. But just as he reached for it, a voice rang out from behind them. "Step away." Slowly, they turned. Pendred stood in the shadows near the attic stairwell, pistol leveled, eyes cold and steady. Gone was the kindly solicitor's demeanor. In its place stood something sharper, harder, an officer in plain clothes, bearing the steel of a man who had lived too long in secrets. "I had hoped to recover it quietly," he said. "But you've left me little choice." Watson instinctively stepped in front of Holt. Holmes was perfectly still. "You were aboard the Icarian." Pendred smiled thinly. "Not in any manifest. I was attached by directive, special communications liaison. No one knew my name. Not even the Admiral." "You ordered the delivery," Holmes said. "And when it failed, when Caro saw, you authorized his removal." "I protected the realm," Pendred replied flatly. "The cargo was intended to prevent war. Caro endangered that." "And the Admiral?" Watson asked. Pendred's gaze tightened. "He was meant to destroy the flag. Instead, he turned it into a reliquary of guilt. Foolish sentiment. And now you've resurrected it." Holmes's voice was calm. "You killed Ash. I gave him a choice. He made his own. And Wren? He resisted. So I persuaded." Pendred stepped forward. "Now, I must erase the final trace." The pistol shifted toward Holmes. Then, a sound. Soft. Almost imperceptible. The creak of a floorboard behind Pendred. He turned. Watson moved. With a swift lunge, he collided with Pendred's side, forcing his shot wide. The pistol discharged, its report deafening in the confined space. Giles and the constables, now charging up the stairwell, seized Pendred before he could fire again. Holmes retrieved the cipher book and the flag remnant. "I believe this completes the Admiral's testament." Pendred, pinned against the attic wall, said nothing. Holmes stepped close. "You spent decades weaving silence into your legacy. But silence, like linen, frays with time." Pendred's stare remained hard, but Holmes saw the faintest crack in his expression. Fear, not of prison but of being known. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed. By midday they had returned to Holt Manor, the pouch secured under Holmes's arm, its contents still unopened. Pendred had surrendered himself without resistance. He now sat under constant guard in the study, silent, unmoving, and for the first time, untethered from the conviction that had driven him. In the drawing room, beneath the Admiral's portrait and beside the empty flag case, Holmes prepared to open the final message. Captain Holt, pale but composed, stood at the fireplace, his arms folded. Watson remained at Holmes's side, watching with quiet intensity as his friend unfolded the parchment, crisp, yellowed with time, sealed in wax that bore no official crest, only a simple indented line drawn by hand. The mark of a man speaking only for himself. Holmes read aloud. July 12, 1893. "If this letter finds a reader, then I have failed in what little courage I summoned. You hold now the burden I could not lift. The Icarian was tasked not with diplomacy but with erasure. Our voyage carried no ambassador, no treaty. We bore one thing only, evidence. Proof of our own nation's betrayal in foreign waters. We were not intercepting treason, we were delivering it. Pendred was the architect. I, its servant. And Caro? Caro was the price. He saw too much. He asked too little. He believed we were better than this. I sewed my guilt into the hem of the flag the Navy swore to preserve. Not as defiance but as memory. Truth like the tide returns. No matter how far you cast it out." There was a long silence when the reading ended. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to stall. Watson cleared his throat gently. "It was never a smuggling operation. Not even espionage." Holmes nodded. "It was a cover-up. A deliberate act of betrayal committed by the very hands meant to prevent it. And the Icarian was chosen not to deliver justice, but to eliminate its trace." Captain Holt stepped forward, his voice quiet. And my grandfather tried to expose it? He tried to carry it, Holmes said. To live with it. And when he couldn't, he preserved it, sewn into history quite literally. The flag became a shroud for a conscience. Inspector Giles entered at that moment, his usual bluster absent. Pendred's been formally charged. We'll escort him to London tomorrow under military guard. There'll be inquiries, hearings. Possibly more arrests if your statement's handed over to the Admiralty. Holmes turned toward the window where the fading light painted streaks across the floorboards. He won't fight it, he said. He's lost the one thing he valued above all, control. Watson turned to Holmes. You said there was one thread still unpulled. There is, Holmes replied, holding up the cipher book and placing it beside the letter. The Admiral recorded far more than his own confession. This book contains coordinates, names, coded lists, some redacted, others obscured. If we're right, it may expose a hidden operation spanning years. Giles exhaled. Then what will you do with it? Holmes looked to Captain Holt. That is not for me to decide. The captain stepped forward, hesitated, then reached for the ledger. He ran a hand across its cover, faintly trembling. I will present it to the Board of Inquiry myself, he said. Let the truth be weighed. Holmes inclined his head. A just act. But even as they spoke, Watson noticed Holmes's gaze drift, not toward the cipher book or the letter, but toward the empty flag case. Later that evening, as the manor quieted and Pendred slept under watch, Holmes and Watson returned to the drawing room one final time. The fire had burned low. The air was still. Holmes spoke softly, almost to himself. There is something oddly poetic, Watson. That a man should take his guilt, stitch it into a symbol of pride, and let it wave above heads who never knew the truth beneath it. Watson said nothing. He had no words for the depth of irony or sorrow such a thought evoked. Holmes moved toward the glass case, touched the brass clasp gently, then closed the lid. I have seen men hide secrets in shadows, in vaults, in whispered lies. But I have never seen one hidden in daylight, under a nation's standard, no less. Watson glanced at his friend, whose face in the low light appeared older somehow. Tired but resolute. You've uncovered the whole of it now, Watson said. Holmes shook his head. Not uncovered. Unraveled. He turned back toward the room. And now, Watson, the threads must be sewn anew. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The morning light that spilled into Holt Manor that day was unlike any that had come before it, pale, golden, and searching. It illuminated dust in the air and truth in every corner. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted into the channel, leaving the estate wrapped in quiet expectancy. At Holmes's request, a final meeting was arranged in the grand hall beneath the Admiral's portrait. Every remaining figure of importance was summoned. Captain Holt, Inspector Giles, Dr. Thacker, and the wounded Mr. Wren, now propped up in a wheeled chair, pale but lucid. Even Pendred, under armed watch, was brought forth, seated apart and in silence. His face bore the expression of a man waiting for the curtain to fall. Holmes stood before the empty glass case that had once held the flag, the cipher book and Caro journal resting on the table beside him. Watson, not far off, observed the room's charged stillness, like the moment before a verdict is read. Holmes cleared his throat. You have all come here, willingly or not, to witness what cannot be buried. The final record of the Icarian. He lifted the cipher book first. This was the Admiral's log. It does not contain what the Admiralty saw fit to preserve, but what he preserved in spite of them. Pages of encoded names, locations and movements. All pointing to one covert operation, the transfer of diplomatic documents not meant for our own hands, but for agents of a foreign power. The Icarian was not a messenger of the crown, it was a pawn in a game meant never to be admitted. He then raised the smaller book. And this, Caro journal, is the last testimony of a man who refused to let the silence consume him. His words are not those of treason but of truth. And they confirm what we now know. Pendred acted under orders that defied any honorable code. A murmur passed through the room, broken only by Wren's faint voice. Caro was just a boy. He deserved to see land again. Holmes turned toward Pendred. Would you like to speak? Pendred looked up slowly. No. I have nothing left to protect. Inspector Giles stepped forward. Then you'll be transferred to London by the afternoon train. The Naval Review Board will be waiting, along with Caro writings. Captain Holt approached Holmes with measured steps. May I see them? He asked softly. Holmes handed him both volumes. The captain held them reverently, like relics of a long-lost faith. So this is the truth my grandfather died with. Watson spoke up gently. He didn't die with it, Captain. He stitched it into memory. And today it is seen. Captain Holt looked at the empty flag case. I will not restore the flag to its mount. Not as a relic. But I will see to it that these books reach the proper authorities, and that Caro name is not forgotten. Holmes nodded. It is the most the dead can ask of the living. From the side of the room, Dr. Thacker stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly. I knew something. Not the whole, but enough to have acted sooner. I chose priage over protest. I hope that counts for something. Holmes said nothing, but the silence he left behind was not one of judgment. Only acknowledgment. The gathering soon dissolved. One by one they departed the hall. Wren was wheeled back to his quarters, his head bowed in contemplation. Thacker returned to his lodgings with the weight of absolution half-earned. Giles gave instructions to the escort team guarding Pendred, who rose without protest and disappeared down the corridor, the door shutting behind him with a finality Watson found difficult to ignore. Only Holmes and Watson remained. They stood alone now beneath the Admiral's portrait. The light from the high windows cast long shadows across the checkered floor. Watson turned to his friend. You've done it, Holmes? You've uncovered the truth. Justice has taken its first breath. But Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Truth is not justice, Watson. One may lead to the other, but they are not the same. Watson sighed. Then what now? Holmes looked to the case once more. I think, he said, we close the case, both glass and figurative. Let the silence rest where it belongs. We are not its guardians. He stepped forward and shut the empty case lid with a soft click. It echoed faintly in the quiet hall, like the last note of a requiem. Then he turned. And now, Watson, I believe we've had quite enough of the sea. Chapter 16, The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. It was not until the train had begun its slow journey back to London, its wheels clicking over iron rails like a ticking clock, that Watson finally turned to Holmes and asked the question he had been holding since they departed Holt Manor. Holmes, there is still something I do not understand, several things in fact. You uncovered a web of deception, uncovered the cipher, caught Pendred, revealed the Admiral's guilt and Caro fate. But how, precisely, did you know? How did you see the path when the rest of us were wandering in fog? Holmes leaned back against the velvet bench, hands steepled, eyes on the window where the Devonshire countryside blurred into green and gray. It was not one path, Watson, but many. And like threads in a tapestry, they all led inward to the same center. Watson waited. Holmes continued, his voice low and methodical. The case began not with a murder but with a whisper sewn, quite literally, into fabric. From the start this was no ordinary theft. The theft of the flag, absent any signs of forced entry, told me one thing: the culprit had knowledge of the manor. This was not a crime of opportunity but of intention. The thread you found in the flag case, Watson said. Precisely. Crimson wool naval weave. And more importantly, frayed. It had been torn, not cut. Someone had removed the flag in haste, not delicately, suggesting that they were under pressure or in fear of discovery. Holmes tapped his fingers lightly on his knee. Then came the whispers reported by the housekeeper. While seemingly supernatural at first glance, they were not the ramblings of a frightened woman. Sound, Watson, true sound requires a source. If it was not imagination, it had to be some kind of mechanical or natural resonance. But the housekeeper's fear gave our thief an opportunity. They knew the flag held something, and they needed it removed before anyone grew curious. Watson nodded. And then the first coded message. The whisper is sewn in the hem. That confirmed it. It was a taunt, Holmes said, and a signal. Not just to us but possibly to others. Pendred may have delivered it himself, or perhaps it came from Miss Torrell as a means of drawing us in. Her role was more complicated than I first realized. Holmes paused, his gaze narrowing slightly. The cipher fragments confirmed my suspicions. When decoded against naval records, they revealed not names, but dates and coordinates. Hidden meetings off the coast, transactions unrecorded in the public logbooks. And more than that, irregular references to RCK, which Pendred tried to obscure as merely a code name. But the real breakthrough came when I cross-referenced the ciphered messages with the Admiral's personal journal. The language in both matched. Idioms, metaphors, even errors. That told me the cipher wasn't a third-party creation. It was his. Watson furrowed his brow. But the cipher book wasn't discovered until later. Indeed, Holmes said. And that's where Pendred erred. He assumed the cipher book had been destroyed or lost. But the Admiral, aware of Pendred's methods, had hidden it in a place no formal investigation would look, a personal chest sealed in the attic. Holmes leaned forward slightly, warming to the structure of his conclusion. Then came the staged attack on Sloane, and the planted coat meant to implicate Ash. That was Pendred's hand again, eliminating loose ends. He needed to keep the remaining veterans disoriented. But Sloane's scribbled note, the phrase, "Stitch anomaly," was a beacon. It meant someone had seen the secret in the flag's hem and knew it wasn't just decorative. That drew Pendred into the open. Watson was silent for a moment, absorbing the sequence. "And yet," he said slowly, "it wasn't until you baited him at Morgan's Reach that he truly revealed himself." "Because he believed," Holmes replied, "that no one else could read the full cipher. He thought himself the last gatekeeper. But when we planted the message claiming to have deciphered the coordinates, he couldn't stay away. He had to confirm whether the documents had been discovered, and destroy them if necessary." Watson shook his head. "But Miss Torrell, why help us at all?" "She was the final thread," Holmes said. "The Admiral entrusted her family, likely her mother or aunt, with the care of the second ledger. Miss Torrell inherited that responsibility, and though she fled initially, she returned once she realized someone had begun to unravel the truth. She played both sides, Watson, informing us just enough to ensure the discovery, but always keeping the final piece hidden until she could be certain Holmes would honor the spirit, not just the detail, of the Admiral's intent." He opened his notebook and pulled a final folded scrap of parchment, "Miss Torrell's farewell. The dead are not always silent, Mr. Holmes. Sometimes they require the living to speak for them. Caro spoke through her," Holmes said softly, "as did the Admiral. And in the end, Pendred was undone not by justice or violence, but by the memory he tried to suppress." Outside, the countryside gave way to the grey sprawl of Greater London, the rooftops rising like a tide. Holmes closed his notebook with a soft snap. "One cannot bury truth forever, Watson. It is like salt in the sea, always there even when unseen." Watson looked toward the window. "And justice?" Holmes gave a slight smile. "Justice, my friend, is when the truth is not only known, but endured." Chapter 17, Outcome and Justice. London, under a slate-gray sky, felt both familiar and foreign as Holmes and Watson stepped onto the platform at Paddington. The city's pulse, cabs rattling, vendors calling, bells tolling, seemed oblivious to the storm of silence and secrets they had just weathered in Devon. Yet within the quiet walls of Whitehall, the reverberations of their findings had already begun to ripple outward. Within 2 days the Admiralty convened a closed tribunal. Captain Elias Holt, true to his word, presented Caro Journal, the cipher book, and his grandfather's final letter to the Naval Review Board. Pendred, once a shadow behind the flag, was now a figure in chains, facing not only formal charges of obstruction, perjury, and conspiracy, but the heavier, unspoken burden of having rewritten a nation's memory for personal preservation. Watson and Holmes were not invited to speak. Their names were acknowledged in the minutes, their involvement classified, with distinction. Yet Holmes neither expected nor desired recognition. Watson, however, insisted they attend the proceedings, if only from the gallery. They sat in the high, echoing chamber as Pendred was led in, gaunt, silent, and still wearing the black coat he had worn in the attic of Holt Manor. The presiding admiral, Sir Percival Ransom, addressed the room in solemn tones. The documents recovered by Captain Holt, and the ledger of the late Rear Admiral Nathaniel Holt, present grave inconsistencies with official records. The tribunal finds, by unanimous decision, that the mission of HMS Icarian in July 1893 was a breach of international agreement and of Admiralty Code. Responsibility for the concealment of these acts rests with then Intelligence Officer Victor Pendred and parties unnamed. The court further recognizes the late Admiral Holt's attempt to preserve an account of these events, however encoded, as an act of conscience. There was no applause, no pronouncement of heroism. Merely silence. And then the sharp rap of the gavel. Holmes and Watson stepped back into the London fog, the sounds of the city closing in once again. "That's it then," Watson said. "Justice done." Holmes gave a faint nod. "Justice acknowledged, perhaps. But the dead remain dead, and the flag remains folded." Watson walked beside him, the brim of his hat catching fine drizzle. "What will become of the documents?" "They will be sealed," Holmes said. "The public will hear whispers, fragments. But not the full cloth. That much at least the Crown still demands." Watson frowned. "And Pendred?" "Life imprisonment most likely. But his sentence began long ago. Men who rewrite history are always the loneliest prisoners." They crossed the street toward Baker Street, passing a newspaper vendor shouting the latest headlines. He folded the cloth again precisely, reverently. Watson watched him in silence. Then after a moment he rose, fetched a pin from his writing desk, and affixed a copy of Caro's final journal entry to the corner of the fireplace mantel. If they forget me, let them remember the sea. For it too knew the truth. Holmes saw the gesture, nodded once. There is poetry in that, he said. The sea forgets nothing. And for those who vanish beneath its surface, perhaps memory is the only justice left. The clock struck 8. Night had arrived in earnest. The fog drifted thick outside the windows, a curtain pulled slowly over the city. Watson sat again and opened his notebook. He turned to a fresh page, dipped his pen in ink and wrote a single line at the top. The whisper sewn into the flag. Holmes lifted his violin and drew the bow slowly across the strings. Not a dramatic tune nor a furious one, but something low and mournful. A melody stitched with silence. A lament for all those who had no voice. As the music swelled gently in the room, Watson continued to write. Not just the facts of the case but its soul. For some truths, once brought into the light, demand more than a verdict. They require telling. Outside, the lamps of Baker Street flickered beneath the mist. And within, the last whisper faded, not into silence but into remembrance.